Success as an individual contributing lawyer in an organization or a firm, specifically in the field of law, requires a very specific set of skills and talents. Sometimes leadership requires taking bold moves. And if you're not the leader that takes those bold moves and someone else, a competitor, does, you can be left in the dust. The 5 toxic myths are the tragic origin myth, the social myth, the ritual myth, the underworld myth, and the doomsday or the apocalyptic myth.
Hello and welcome to another Justia webinar. My name is Nina and I'll be the moderator for today. Now to kick things off, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Scott Mason. Scott Mason is an attorney and transformational executive leadership coach for lawyers looking to up-level their careers and leadership skills and have a future that, as he puts it, is epic. Based on his trailblazing signature framework, Scott will help you or the leaders in your firm or organization become more connected to themselves, their colleagues, and their mission, as well as becoming more creative and resilient. The webinar that you're about to watch will be approximately 1 hour, and once the presentation is complete, Scott will be taking questions from the audience. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Scott, please feel free to submit them through that Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, here is Scott to discuss elevating as a leader.
Today, we're going to be talking about how you can move from being a sole contributor at your law firm or in your organization into a leader and have that transition be one that is triumphant. You know, for a lot of us, the big leap into the unknown from being that lawyer who's reviewing documents in an office or trying a case all by yourself or maybe with the assistance of a paralegal or some small group, and then going into a real leadership role, whether it's leading your own company or starting your own firm or being an executive in a larger organization, is a massive jump into the unknown. We want today to make sure that you end up having that jump be a smashing success, not a faceplant. And that, at the end of the day, is why this course matters. But let's talk a little bit more about why it matters so that you can concretize that a little bit and think about it in terms of ways that are really meaningful for you and address specific problem areas. Success as an individual contributing lawyer in an organization or a firm, specifically in the field of law, requires a very specific set of skills and talents. And those I've enumerated to some extent here. Raw intellect. We have to be smarter. We can't finish law school, let alone even get in law school and pass the bar. The ability to spot issues, the capacity to discern and differentiate between subtly different factual scenarios. In other words, the understanding of nuance, in fact, and how nuance in case holdings or in statutes themselves, or the blank spaces in statutes or case law can lead to different outcomes. Attention to detail. Anyone who's done document review can attest to that. And then mastery of legal writing and argumentation skills. These skills, as rare and important as they are not the same ones that any of us will need if we move into real leadership positions. And that includes whether it is within a larger organization, such as a firm, or like I said, a company you may be working for, or in the case of legal entrepreneurship. Too often, lawyers or the firms that employ them assume that, well, this lawyer was smart, they're a good lawyer, their legal writing is excellent, their analytical skills are great, they've won a bunch of cases, that automatically means they can lead a team. Unfortunately, that thinking has led to a lot of organization and professional toil and trouble. Lawyer leadership may seem like a more professionally satisfying and prestigious track than remaining a lawyer's lawyer. And it actually can be that way too. But if the skills that you're applying day to day are stuck in that lawyer's lawyer role and not in the role of an organizational manager or leader, then career derailment, reputational damage, staff defections, even negative hits on your or your company's bottom line can occur. And that is why, more than anything else, making sure that your transition to leadership succeeds is the core and the heart of why this course is here. Who is this course for? First of all, as may be obvious, it is here for any attorney that is seeking to transition into a law firm leadership role, such as a practice group leader or leading a firm committee or an administrative position, something like that. It's also for in-house counsel who may have been spending a lot of time dealing with a very narrow set of legal tasks, but are looking to move into, say, a deputy general counsel or a general counsel role even, or maybe move into a programmatic or sales or operational or other sort of role within the company that employs them. And then lawyers seeking to build their own business, particularly if you want that business to move beyond you and maybe one executive assistant. If you want to build a legal business that scales, you're going to have to take in everything I say to you today, and it will really have a transformative, positive impact on where your company goes. Who am I? Well, you can look at my bio to find out more, but suffice it to say, my mission in life is to help attorneys who need the mindset, the vision, and the powerhouse personal voice, in other words, the charisma, to magnetize and monetize professional leadership, or professional freedom as leaders or as owners of their own businesses, be able to find their way there, and specifically to become leaders worthy of Mount Olympus. And that's exciting stuff for me. Just to briefly go over what we're going to talk about today, we're going to differentiate between executive skills and legal skills. I mentioned earlier that they're not exactly the same. We're going to really do a deep dive into that. We're going to discuss a particular challenge that lawyers stepping into executive leadership roles or entrepreneurial roles often face, which is the relationship that we as professionals who deal in risk every day have. It can be very fraught. How is the relationship that we have to risk as sole contributing lawyers the same as what an executive or an entrepreneurial leader might be facing? And how do we manage risk if to the extent that the approach to risk differs? And then we're going to really put together a process step for making the mindset and skill development steps necessary to successfully transition into leadership. We're going to briefly discuss personal myths and professional outcomes. We're going to discuss 5 toxic myths that can keep you from moving into the successful mindset of a leader. We're going to also talk about how to obliterate those toxic myths. We're going to discuss what needs to be in an action plan to be able to build lawyer leadership strength, and we're going to talk about the role of accountability and the role of blame. Of course, because ethics CLE's credits are part of this, we're going to be discussing ethical considerations, and then finally, we're going to be reviewing the takeaways so you can remember stuff. So let's get into the heart of this presentation by starting the discussion on what are the core executive skills possessed by that lady on the left versus the sole contributor skills that are hopefully possessed by that poor man drowning in paper to the right. How exactly did he move from where he is, or how can he move from where he is into where she is? Well, let's begin by understanding exactly what the key legal individual contributor skills are rooted in and how those differentiate from the one most important executive leadership skill that there is. And then we'll begin to figure out how to bridge the gap between the two. In order to be a successful sole practicing and sole contributing lawyer, you have to be able to exercise an aggregation of knowledge. The exercise of knowledge is the key skill that an individual contributing attorney brings into the room. It's very specific knowledge. It's relating to the subject matter area of the law that you're practicing, relating to the state of the law that you're practicing and perhaps future trends, relating to things like court rules, parameters of the client's legal or ethical needs, as well as a whole host of other things, the regulatory landscape that you're operating in. All these sorts of things are very specific areas of knowledge that you have to really understand and be able to apply into various situations, but they are nonetheless all rooted in knowledge. And I mentioned earlier the aggregation of knowledge. That's because law is one of the few areas where experience actually can benefit you. It's not like, oh, you know too much about law, we don't want to hire you. Oh, you've been around too long and you've seen too much and you've been doing too much in your life, we don't want to hire you. That's not usually what happens with lawyers. As we build knowledge and build experience applying it, we are able to command more money, respect, prestige, and able to move up the ladder. So experience matters for sole contributing lawyers, but principally vis-a-vis the application of law in novel situation. In other words, it's an escalation of the knowledge that we have that justifies us being able to have the social prestige that we do, the professional prestige, as well as the money that the best of us can command. On the other hand, successful executive leadership isn't always about knowledge at all. I had successful executive leadership roles, sometimes over massive groups of people and of related to issues of extreme consequence with no subject matter expertise at all. The core skill that I brought into the room and that a successful executive or entrepreneurial leader brings into the room is rooted in wisdom. What is the difference between the two in the context that we're discussing today? Now, there are online a zillion different places that you can go to find out what the core executive leadership skills are. And again, anytime I'm referring to executive leadership skills here in this presentation, I also am referring to entrepreneurial skills, or at least insofar as that entrepreneurial skill involves the desire of the entrepreneur to build an organization. So if I forget one, it's not, it's simply there. I'm using them a little bit synonymously here. And the key executive leadership skills that I found that are most comprehensive and that help people the most have been summarized in an article that I quote at the bottom of this slide and that you'll get as part of your supplementary materials, which are critical thinking, innovation, adaptability, negotiation, motivation, team building, decision-making, and of course, integrity. Now, that's the most comprehensive list that I could find without being overly comprehensive, but I'd like to add on, just in my own experience and from working with clients in this area, a couple of other key skills: strategic thinking, visioning, in other words, the ability to imagine what something might be or what your team or organization might be 5, 10, 15, even 30 years down the road. Is both of these are key skills, as well as the ability to achieve measurable results. If you're not able to achieve results, usually financial, but there may be other metrics as well, you're not going to be a leader for very long. I think all of us intuitively know that. So, how does the application of knowledge versus executive leadership wisdom differentiate? How does one differentiate from the other? Well, first of all, the legal knowledge sphere within which attorneys operate is swimming in waters that by and large are shaped by the adversarial system. That's the first thing we learn in law school, or one of the very first things, that our legal system is based on the idea that by presenting opposing point of views, the truth comes out and the optimal outcome occurs. That is great for the practice of law, and mastering and understanding the role of the adversarial system in our practice is, of course, going to make us successful. But in an executive leadership role, building is what it's all about. And adversarialism can be viewed very, very negatively. As a matter of fact, people will not collaborate with you if they view you as adversarial. They won't want to give you their money, because most people will not spend money on individuals that they view in one way or another as hostile to them. And people won't work for you very long if they're skilled because they don't like being treated in an adversarial manner either. And so the adversarial backdrop versus the building backdrop, or the mindsets that executive leaders operate in versus sole contributor lawyers, really can play out in ways that are dramatic. The big picture focus on the larger organization or the team needs, as well as that vision in the future, is utterly and completely core to executive leadership success, whereas sole contributing lawyer success usually hinges on a focus on detail. And that detail might be, okay, how can this law be interpreted in a way that benefits my client? Or how can it be interpreted to help find my client to be not guilty of whatever it is that they are being accused of in this litigation, or a whole host of other related things. So in contracts or leases or documents like that, attention to detail is huge. As we all know, a comma can make a difference between winning a case and losing a case in a contract dispute. And so really, executive leader isn't going to care about the placement of that comma. They're going to care about how that contract plays into the larger strategic goals of the organization. Two completely different ways of looking at the same types of documents and the same milieu within which they're all operating, which is that organization itself. And so that goes as to wisdom as a broader matter, and the application of specific legal knowledge. Wisdom in leadership has been best defined, at least to my ears, as the combined use of awareness, experience, and insight to set direction, empower people, ensure well-being, and guide activity to achieve lasting results. And you'll see the source of that quote again in the slide in the supplemental materials. But note, there are some words in here that are really not applicable to those that are swimming in sole contributorship waters. Empowering people, that might not be your first priority when you're reading a lease, sitting in your office at 3 a.m. Or ensuring well-being, particularly of the staff or of the larger world that you're operating in. That's not always a lawyer's top priority if they are working on a specific legal project. And achieving lasting results. Rarely is legal work about achieving a lasting result. It may be if it's impact litigation, or if it's the sort of litigation that somehow or leads to a major regulatory change or some transformational outcome for business or the culture as a whole. But again, thinking about things like reviewing laws, rules, and regulations, or thinking about compliance, those are really helping the business make it through whatever specific challenge that they're facing, or an individual making it through the challenge that they're facing, and not necessarily a lasting result that one can bank their legacy on, in the same way that an executive leader may be thinking about what they're looking to do. So the key to exercising leadership wisdom involves understanding the relationship of risk to the trajectory of the entity that they are in charge of leading, whether it's a practice group or a legal department or an entire company. And that a lawyer leader is ultimately responsible for overseeing. So key elements of our training as lawyers and our job functions as lawyers, particularly during those years when we're right out of law school and we're learning the tools of the trade, we're learning how to be lawyers, and then we're learning how to be good lawyers and not just lawyers, make this particular facet of leadership wisdom particularly complicated. Why? Because as lawyers, what we are involved in above and beyond all else is usually the relationship of risk to our clients' ongoing objectives. Many of us, because of the depth of risk oversight that we're involved in, can come to view risk in the same way that this individual is viewing the place on that cliff that they may jump from, as something that's very scary and to be avoided at all costs. What I'm going to argue here is that for lawyers stepping into leadership role, a right-sized relationship to risk is of absolute importance if we are going to succeed as organizational or firm leaders of any sort whatsoever. So, what do executive leaders and lawyers who are individual contributors have in common vis-a-vis their relationship to risk? First of all, and in general, how are the two functions the same? Both executives of all types and individual contributor lawyers operate within larger interlocking legal and regulatory frameworks, which must be understood and effectively managed. Even if you, for instance, run a business that is largely unregulated with regards to its subject matter, you still operate, for instance, within the regulatory and legal frameworks with regards to payment of taxes, as well as human HR, as well as discrimination and equal treatment, as well as payroll and a whole host of other things. And so a successful organizational executive and a successful individual contributing lawyer need to be able to forecast risk and needs to be able to prepare for them. And that is both at a micro level as well as at a macro level. In other words, environmental scanning, the business environment that you're operating in outside of your company, seeing when risks are forthcoming and being able to think about, okay, how might those play out and how can we keep them from being disasters is important for both groups of people. And by the way, it presumably goes without saying, but maybe not. Both executive leaders and, of course, lawyers working for those leaders in a sole contributing role share a common interest in mitigating the impact of the risks when they do actualize. Ideally, they share an interest in eliminating the risks at all, but if they can't be, limiting the potential scope and the financial damage that they can cause. But how do the two roles differ when it comes to the relationship that they have with risk? Legal individual contributors operate inherently defensively because of the adversarial system within which we operate and have been trained in from the first days of law school, even if that defensiveness is proactive. And when I talk about proactive defensiveness, what I'm referring to is the idea that we may, for instance, say, let's put this provision in the contract, let's say liquidated damages. And the reason why we put that in there, that's a proactive step. And it is something that's really thinking about actions that are yet to come, but it is rooted in defense of that client should a conflict arise. And so because of that defensive nature, and part and parcel to it, an individual contributing lawyer has a narrower role within the organization and therefore a sharper and a shorter term focus within the organization. So for instance, if you are working for an organization that has a lot of facilities, a lawyer working for that company may be mostly concerned with any legal issues related to facilities management, or again, as we've talked about earlier, leases. These have a short-term focus and maybe not necessarily a longer-term focus with regards to the life of the organization, because, hey, most organizations, if they continue to grow and scale, ultimately grow out of or change locations over time. And that goes as to things like litigation as well. Most litigation does not go on, let's hope, for the entire life of an organization. Usually at some point the litigation ends and the organization continues. And so lawyers that are working as sole contributors within an organization require a high level of attention to the details that create or minimize risk, a language and things like contracts or in financing agreements, procedures such as filing deadlines or court rules if there's litigation going on, compliance postings, heaven knows, as well as what's in staff manuals, things like that. And then corporate optics can be an important role for individual contributing lawyers, because practically every quality lawyer that I know has at one point or another said to a client, look, what you're doing may not technically be legal or illegal, but it really looks bad. And that's an important function. But it is still different than what a team or organizational leader is thinking about with regards to risk. So usually an organizational leader is focusing on playing offense. In other words, obtaining positive results, and see risk solely within that lens. Will this risk unacceptably threaten our ability to achieve a result? Is this risk worth taking? And how big is the risk? But then they're also considering a whole host of other things: marketing, operations, supply chain, human resource concerns, all these sorts of things. So, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, they view risk as only one of various factors that impact business behavior. And they have an eye on issues that occur beyond the overall framework of the risk. In other words, whereas I mentioned a few minutes ago, the lawyer's role and the things that the lawyers are working on don't necessarily go through the entire life of the organization. Many leaders are thinking about the entire lifetime of an organization, or at least the long term, as much as they are the midterm and the immediate term issues that might be facing the organization right then and there. One way to think about this from an executive leadership perspective is an executive leader is thinking, well, what happens the day after that risk is either actualized or it disappears or is mitigated? Whereas the lawyer is thinking about, well, how do we avoid that risk? And then how do we deal with that risk as it is materializing to continually keep it under control? So executive leaders frequently are big picture or strategic thinkers. In fact, the more you step into executive leadership roles, and I know this from personal experience, the less likely you are to be able to maintain a focus on detail. It's just too much. There's too many things to focus on, to be thinking about where a comma is placed, to sort of refer to an earlier example. And they are sometimes tactical, but strategy and vision, which we've mentioned a few times already, come into play more and more and more and more, and take up more and more of the focus as these tactics and details are delegated to sole contributors. So how, as an executive leader, do you manage risk? You understand that this complicated relationship exists as an initial matter, and that the way that we are trained as lawyers to think, in other words, how we become lawyers in our minds, can create a certain lens through which we view risk that can be antithetical to successful executive leadership. Once we're aware of that, then we're able to then begin to nip it in the bud when it comes up, and we're able to rethink about how we're assessing problems. And if we find an excess of risk aversion coming up, well, then we're able to at least identify it and right size it with regards to all of the other issues that we need to be looking at. So making that mindset shift that's rooted in acknowledgement is extraordinarily important. Surrounding yourself with people who have different views of risk than you do is of huge positive consequence. So, for instance, I spent a part of my career since as I moved into my current life, working with a venture studio. And the people that are in the studio, and for those who don't know what a venture studio is, it basically is a company that identifies gaps in the market and figures out creative, innovative solutions to it, and builds companies around those, invests in them, and then later tries to get those companies up and moving as independent entities out in the world. And anyone who's going to be doing that sort of work is inherently very, very open and comfortable with risk, because anytime you are investing your time and your money and energy into something that is completely new and oftentimes untested in the world, you are not risk averse. And being around people like that allowed me to see how I was addressing risk internally due to my many years of sole contributor legal practice through a completely different lens, in a way that was starker than I had ever encountered before. And then you always want to make sure that as you step into an executive leadership role, that you are learning the entirety of the business from soup to nuts, as well as the entirety of the environment that it is in. So then you can, again, place risk within its appropriate larger scale context. And so this is not the only thing that you're seeing. But nonetheless, you also want to, as you move into executive leadership, always, always, always assess the risk of risk aversion. So if you find yourself, despite everything that we've talked about so far, naturally defaulting into a risk aversive mindset, perhaps it can help you to think as often as you can that what appears to be safety that risk aversion can provide actually can be quite dangerous, because if you've not leaned into new things, if you view taking bold steps as something that's dangerous and scary, and you bring that into your leadership, well, when the environment that you're in, the external environment, the business environment, the leadership environment within your organization shift, you can be stuck. Sometimes leadership requires taking bold moves. And if you're not the leader that takes those bold moves and someone else, a competitor, does, you can be left in the dust. So risk aversion itself can be risky, and making sure you understand that is absolutely pivotal to managing risk as a leader. And then never, ever underestimate, or heaven forbid, forget the ethical implications of downplaying risk. Note that I mentioned, or I described the slide as how to manage risk, not how to completely lean into it. If throwing aside risk aversion means that you are putting you or your company or your team at risk or in danger of violating any ethical considerations or the law, then you're going too far when it comes to your newfound love of risk, and you want to pull back. So how do you take all of what I've told you a few minutes ago and then begin to actively transition into leadership? I'm going to start by talking about the concept of personal myths. I host a YouTube interview series, and I recently had an interview with a former NASA astrophysicist who's now a dream coach. And one of the things that this brilliant person told me that has really stuck with me is that myths are the public expression of our private narratives. Our private narratives are the internalization of the public narratives that are out there if we don't take control over them. And so when it comes to the narratives that we tell ourselves that ultimately guide us, that's why I use the term myths, because they are usually incorporating stories or narrative elements or cultural mores or other junk that's not native to who and what we are. The professional narratives that we tell ourselves about where we came from, who we are, where we're at, and where we're going, particularly as leaders, can drive us to or away from success, depending on what those myths are. We often tell ourselves these myths subconsciously without even realizing them. But when they are internalizations of cultural or social narratives that are not native to who and what we are, our unique purpose, our values, then they become mythologized inside, and they can become things that are very, very difficult to shift away from. Excuse me. So, the internal myths that make lawyers successful in individual contributor roles can destroy them. They can destroy us as leaders if we're not thorough in our understanding of them and diligent and self-disciplined in our moving to cut them off. There are 5 types of toxic personal myths, and I'm going to briefly go through them as an overview, and then we're going to deep dive into each of them. The 5 toxic myths are the tragic origin myth, the social myth, the ritual myth, the underworld myth, and the doomsday or the apocalyptic myth. By the way, sort of going back to this theme of why I'm using the word myth, these are all actual genres of mythology, and they became genres of mythology because they represent genres of personal narratives that people tell themselves that are toxic. What are these toxic myths in more detail? Let's start with the tragic origin myth. The tragic origin myth exists when you or someone that you care about believes that the circumstances of their birth or early life determine their professional outcomes. And a telltale sign that someone is living out this myth is when you hear things like, well, that's just who I am. It's who I've always been. It's who I'm always going to be. That's what I was taught. I behave this way, or I have this mindset, or do things this way because, well, that's the way I was raised. That is a classic example of someone having their personal narrative, their myth, governed by the circumstances of their early life. And it is inherently backward looking. It's not ever saying This is what I can become. This is who I'm capable of changing into. This is what's possible in the future. And team and organizational and executive and entrepreneurial leadership of any type all require us, above all else, to think about the future. Think about the core executive skills that we discussed earlier in this presentation. Things like motivating people or achieving results. If you're only looking into the past, no one is motivated by the past. People are motivated by what they can become in the future, what we can bring. People spend money on the future. So if our mindset as leaders is rooted in the past, we're not going to be able to meet the needs of those that we serve, those that our organizations serve, our stakeholders, or those that work for us. So, an example of someone living out this particular toxic myth, who's a lawyer who has transitioned into a leader, is, well, during my many years as a litigator, I fought with everyone. I did some Bronx Street style lawyering, and that's who I am when I lead. So that's just too bad. Or, I was slow and I had a lot of issues around decision making because my job really didn't relate to decision making. It required me to be intentional and deliberate. Well, the leadership position that you're in now might be one which fast thinking and being decisive in a rapidly changing environment is life or death. And if you are saying those sorts of things to yourself or someone around you, I would strongly consider thinking about the tragic origin myth as one that's being told inside. The social myth occurs when you are making decisions or taking actions based on the social expectations of others, whether they are real or perceived, because we all know that half the time what we think everyone wants has nothing to do with what people actually do. And a telltale sign of this is pretty obvious. What will people think if I do X, Y, Z, or if I make this decision? Or that's how you present if you are in this role, right? You wear a suit if you are an organizational leader, ignoring the fact that, great leaders of all sorts out there have worn things other than suits to their jobs. So, that's a sign that someone's sort of trapped in the social myth. And the danger of the social myth is that it is inherently inauthentic. You're basing how you present and the decisions that you make on something that's external to who and what you are. And particularly in leadership environments, especially those that involve bringing in money, people will not spend or invest money in anything that they view as fake. People don't like working for leaders that they view as insincere or phony. And stakeholders, people will generally not collaborate with those that they don't trust. Living out the social myth creates and fosters a low trust working environment. And by the way, if you're making your actions based on the approval of other people, social mores are changing faster than ever. So you're going to really have to do a lot of catching up. It's really stressful. I just say, be yourself and make your decisions based on what's right for you and your business and what makes most sense overall. So an example of someone who is a lawyer who's become a leader who's living out the social myth is cited at the bottom here. Good bosses only care about the numbers. I only care about the numbers, especially those billable hours, because that's what people outside are going to want to see. It might not be what people outside want to see. There are people, for instance, that will not work with companies, even if they are able to bring in a lot of money or have people working away to death to 24 hours to provide their legal needs. They may want to work with people, for instance, where they have a hospitable or decent work environment, or they may want to work for organizations that are focused on something other than how big the bill is that they get. So just be thinking about this sort of thing as you consider what the rubrics are for your decision makings or decisions that you make as a leader. The ritual myth occurs when you consistently engage in behaviors over and over again, even though they no longer serve you. A telltale sign is I just do this. I just do this. This is the way I am, over and over, right? And I've always done this. Now, this is different than the tragic origin myth, because the person who says this probably had a legitimate reason at one time or another for beginning to engage in that behavior pattern or think in that mindset that had nothing to do with their personal or professional origins, but they were addressing a need. But they probably overlearned that behavior and are having trouble breaking out of it, even if circumstances change. It shows a lack of adaptability, therefore, which can work in an individual contributor context. For instance, lawyers all the time say, this is the way I try my cases. This is the way I'm going to review my leases. But it cannot work in leadership environments where there's a lack of stability. And in most organizations that are within operate within any sort of business ecosystem that is changing, which is like every business ecosystem in the entire world right now, right? The ability to adapt is paramount from a leadership perspective. And an example of what this might look like for a lawyer leader is, compliance has always been my professional focus. And so as the owner of a manufacturing firm, I'm going to make sure that my top priority is compliance. Well, it is a priority, but if your employees aren't getting paid, you're going to have other priorities too. Or if your staff is disaffected, or if your company is not getting clients because you don't have a vision or a differentiator, all of these things that executive leadership brings into the room. You've got to be able to manage risk and whatever it is that you've been trained to focus on or have as a behavior pattern within the larger context of what that organization actually needs in order to survive and thrive. The underworld myth is a worldview that is dominated by cynicism and distrust. In other words, it's typified by an attitude of hopelessness, whether that's intellectual, it's mental, spiritual, or emotional. And a real good sign that someone is living out the underworld myth is when they say things like, the real reason why XYZ happened is blah, blah, blah. Again, teams need positive motivation in order to succeed. Customers need to believe that something is positive before they spend their money on it. And people also want to partner with or support organizations that are bringing something positive into the room. Cynicism is the opposite of all of that stuff. Most people will not galvanize behind any leader that they view as being completely hopeless in their outlook. So if you say, when I litigated, I learned the truth. Everyone lies. And as the head of this legal unit, I know all of you all are going to lie to me. I will never forget that lesson. And that includes our customers too. You're probably living out the underworld myth to the detriment of your ability to lead. The doomsday myth is related but distinctive at the same time. This occurs when you are seeing cataclysm around every corner. Telltale signs that you're living out the doomsday myth is that you are reluctant to delegate anything because you see a doomsday if the person that you delegate to messes up, or if you are constantly hysterical about everything. If a broken nail is the same from your perspective as a nuclear bomb going off, you are living out the doomsday myth. And the danger of that is that control or fear-based management drives away top performers and leaves you only with those that have acclimated to this or that are just clock watchers, basically, that are C-list team members that you might need in your team, but you don't want them to be the whole team. And so someone who does this is the sort that says, oh, I see a mistake here, I'm just going to do it myself. Or this has to happen now. This is the top priority now. And then the next day, well, this is the top priority now. And everyone is running around trying to figure out what the real top priority is. So how do you obliterate these? First of all, you need to acknowledge that the toxic myth is happening. And then you need to weigh, honestly, the cost of living out that toxic myth. Not just the costs that have happened, but costs in the future. Staff churn, poor performing team members, opportunities to collaborate or to work well with others that lead to decreased financial or other outcomes. All of these are the sorts of costs that you really want to weigh and then think about, well, how much more could be achieved if I had a high-performing team and one that was excited and engaged in what I was doing. Remember, by the way, the financial and professional value of your credibility and your reputation. If you own a business, people are not likely to bring you business if you're living out one of these toxic myths. Similarly, if word gets around that you are living out the doomsday myth or the underworld myth or any of these other toxic myths, your promotability or your ability to get other jobs is going to be compromised. And that's a definite bottom line outcome that you don't want to get caught in. And so you want to always assess the cost of continuing to operate within the rubric of toxic myths. Then you need to take the time and the energy to invest in leadership development that includes within the executive coaches or other leadership development programs framework the ability to address these toxic myths. You want to make sure that this investment that you make is both in terms of time, energy, and money. Don't spend the money if you're not going to put in the work. This is hard stuff, although these are soft skills. Soft skills can be very, very hard, as a friend of mine once said. And then you want to make sure that you, as you are working on this development, that you are at the same time also beginning to think of yourself, not just as a lawyer, but as a leader. What does a leader do? Not just what would I have done when I was a lawyer. Thinking is not enough. All of this needs to be backed up with action, specifically a plan. So what needs to be in that plan? How do you put it together? The first thing you want to do is engage in what I call a leadership self-diagnostic. You want to start by focusing on the positive. Of the leadership skills that I mentioned earlier in this training, what are 1 to 5 that you see yourself as already having? And how can I elevate them even further? And you identify those by looking within, but also spending some time to talk to those within your circle who you trust and who will be honest with you about what your strengths are. And you'll probably find that there's certain consistencies with regards to them. So, for instance, it may or may not surprise you to know that when I did this, people said a high level of energy. You have, Scott. Everyone, everywhere I went, said that. And so that was something that's really good from a leadership perspective. Let me begin to think about that as something that's a core strength that I want to take to another level. And then you prioritize those strengths that you want to elevate from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest priority, as things that you want to, or as things you want to develop in relationship to the specific leadership role that you have. And then you want to write down 3 to 5 steps that you can take to improve them. And they can include everything from mentoring or coaching to taking classes or to joining masterminds or reading books, listening to podcasts, a whole host of things. All of these things can help build those skills. And then make sure that you add time frames and key success measurements so that you know what you've achieved them. And you can be creative about these success measurements. They can be, for instance, that for the first time today, I really brought my full set of energy into a staff meeting. And it was successful because after it was over, I asked everyone how excited they were about doing this project, and everyone said they were extremely excited. That's the sort of success measurement that you can write down that might not look like a traditional KPI, but it can show the value that you have brought into the room, as well as convince yourself this is a path that was well worth taking, because it is a path well worth taking. Next, you want to figure out what skills you don't have that you want to step into. And you want to break down what those skills are into 2 broad groups. The first are the skills that you just will never learn, because no matter what you do, you will never have those skills. So let's say one of the skills that you realize you need in order to be a successful organizational leadership, like let's say you're starting your own law firm, is an understanding of finance and how to read financials, particularly P&L sheets and balance sheets. You are working hard. It's just you and maybe a small team, and historically you've been entering that data. You're a terrible proofreader, you're terrible at entering data, and that's a skill you're just never going to learn. Well, that's the sort of thing that you want to immediately begin to identify as something to offload onto someone else. Don't waste your time developing skills that you don't have and never will have. Entering data right into a computer, especially numerical data, right? Like, that's a skill I'll never have. I've just given up on that one. Others are skills that you don't have, but you can learn. For instance, let's say you want to be more energetic when it comes to your personal presentation out in the world. Well, that's something you can learn. And then you want to prioritize that vis-a-vis the particular environment that you are stepping into leadership in. And then again, to develop a plan to develop steps that will get you there, find the resources to get you there, and then begin to identify the time frames and the success metrics. When you assess. There is one area that I ask every single attorney to really focus on, and that is how you deal with accountability versus blame. This is something that's very specific to lawyers. Many non-lawyers don't have this issue, but when you think about it, there's a reason why lawyers in particular could have developing an accountability mindset and developing accountability actions when they move into their leadership role, as why it would need to be a greater priority for an attorney than it would be for other groups. So as we've been talking about throughout this presentation, the adversarial system is fundamentally rooted in blame shifting. Litigation, criminal law is all about assigning blame and then making sure that the appropriate individual or company that is to blame for something bad happening pays. Regulatory and compliance work, as well as a lot of transactional work, is all about avoiding blame, or in the case of transactional work, making sure that blame is clearly assigned before it even happens. So the focus is on who and what will be responsible for something when it happens. In other words, who is to blame. On the other hand, successful organizational leadership is rooted in what will galvanize people and resources in order to achieve a positive outcome, and that requires accountability. Accountability, as I and many other people define it, occurs when someone says, or an organization, if that's the case, says, we're responsible for this. We did this. Now, let's do what we can to correct it, or if it's not correctable, let's change our actions going forward. It's not about punishment so long as there weren't laws or ethical canons being violated, but about using mistakes and errors as learning opportunities. Successful leadership thrives on a culture of accountability because that actually furthers increased results as people learn from their mistakes and they have the freedom to admit their mistakes and take ownership for them and be better next time and mentor other people that way. In addition, it's inherently future and action oriented. Legal training and the systems within which we operate as attorneys incentivize and reward, as I mentioned earlier, blame oriented mindsets. But the risk averse nature of the profession can exacerbate this when we become leaders in organizations that need to have accountability as a cultural touchstone. So making sure that we do not fall into the toxicity that can be inherent when leaders bring a blame-based culture into their organization is a core issue that almost every lawyer needs to face, again, due to our acculturation as attorneys. And removing the blame mindset needs to be something that we are always thinking about. And if there are lawyers that are under our supervision who might not be acting in a specifically legal role, but they might be, for instance, running our operations or our administration, we also need to make sure that we're mentoring them to move away from that as well. The surprising upside, by the way, though, of the adversarial system and of legal practice itself is that almost inherently a lawyer who's been practicing for any amount of time is going to bring a massive, significant mindset and way of acting into the room as leaders, and that is with regards to strategy. In order to avoid all of the blame that will accrue to someone who has to live with the consequences of organizational failures or personal failures, right? We develop strategies to deal with those things, whether it is our strategy in a negotiation or our strategy in litigation. And strategic thinking skills are of critical importance to an organizational leader because strategy is how you get from where you are now into the vision that you are going to want to begin to have your team or your organization fall into in the future. So it really does support organizational leadership and success. How can you dehabituate a blame mindset and build an accountability mindset? First of all, really take the time to understand, why am I a leader at all? And think about it in terms of purpose, not I'm a leader because it's more prestigious, or I want more money, or I can get a bigger office. It really should be, well, what do I bring into the room for others that being a leader justifies? So in my case, for instance, let's go back to the energy. I bring that energy into the room, which hopefully then can motivate people to do good things in the world. That's part of my purpose as a leader. And then you think about that is why you might want to be a leader personally. You need to understand that, but then you also need to have a positive myth, so to speak, about why you're in that position positionally. As a general counsel, for instance, I might have said to myself, I am going to then bring that energy to have a very proactive approach to providing general counsel and to get people excited about the role and the importance of the lawyers in my unit. And that's why I'm in this particular position from a purpose perspective. And then you also want to consider, and I urge writing all of this down, what are my inner truth values as a leader? What do I stand for? And then I recommend all of my clients identify a leadership avatar that can sort of act as a North Star. And it's someone that probably is aligned with the first two bullet points here. Now, one of my leadership avatar at various points in my career has been Jack Dorsey, the original founder of Twitter. There are a lot of things that he brought into the room as a leader that I saw myself is connected to from a values and a purpose perspective. And he's really helped me when I think about, okay, how am I making a decision? How am I presenting? How am I being? This also, by the way, puts you in a position, once you have done all of these things and documented them, of being able to replace the toxic myths that we talked about earlier with some narratives that are positive. And then you want to, as you're putting together all of these plans that we've been talking about so far, particularly the leadership development plans, you're going to want to make sure that they have accountability systems into them, so that when life's ups and downs come your way, whether they are workload issues or major tragedies that happen in your life, you're still able to move forward. Just because something is hard doesn't mean you stop. And those accountability systems ideally clarify how you will act. In other words, they will state this is what will happen if this goal isn't being met due to these numbers of circumstances, and then how you'll course correct should you fall off course or should circumstances change. And ideally, you want to work with a coach, a mentor, a mastermind group, a personal board of advisors. I'd have that, and or other leadership support structure. Make sure that as you are around those people and you're going through your plan, that you're always open and transparent with them. And then don't ever be afraid of being transparent with your team when you have not lived up to your own North Star. You'll build credibility with them. They'll respect you more. Not only that, but then they will be that way with you and with others when they've made mistakes. Okay. Ethical considerations. You always want to make sure that any and all ethical obligations related to your jurisdiction have been put into place as you transition into leadership. I've listed a few here from the model rules, but obviously there are local variations, jurisdictional variations on all of these things. Rules of confidentiality regarding those that you represent or have represented as you move away from day-to-day practice into legal leadership. It's huge. Make sure you're familiar with those. Maintaining representation duties both to former clients and current clients as and then after you transition. Again, all of the rules related to those, including those related to conflicts of interest. And then make sure that if you are moving from, let's say, being an associate corporation counsel for the government or an assistant corporation counsel into a leadership role, whether it's in an outside organization or within government, that you are always following the ethical conflicts rules with regards to government employees, because those are sometimes more strict and they're not exactly the same. If you're no longer licensed as you move into leadership roles, for heaven's sake, make sure that you are following those rules around holding yourself out as a practitioner. And then always pay attention to the rules regarding supervision of attorneys or those that are supporting legal tasks. And I've identified those here in the model rules. Suffice it to say, just because you're not practicing law, your primary function as a leader, doesn't mean that you can in any way enable or tolerate unethical behaviors happening, and you can be held accountable for those. The rules make the specifics of that very clear. And then always follow the ethical rules regarding representing an organization that employs you if you are moving into a leadership role, let's say a C-suite role within a large organization. And make sure, like I said earlier, that you're following any local laws. So what are the key takeaways in the last minute or two here before we move into questions? The skills that you need in order to succeed as an individual contributor lawyer aren't the same as executive skills. The lack of leadership skills that are those which are different than the sole contributing lawyer skills, if they are not appropriately developed, can derail your career, reputation, and your financial success, and that is business and professional. Success as an individual contributor is related to knowledge. As an executive leader, you're going to need to focus on wisdom, and the lawyer's fraught relationship with risk can make that journey to executive wisdom a hard one. Toxic myths about one's professional narrative or identity can additionally keep attorneys from developing the mindset that's necessary in order to move into organizational leadership. But replacing those toxic myths with a new professional narrative rooted in values, purpose, and tied into ethics will help set you up for a successful transition, and making sure that you do that with an actionable plan that focuses on developing your existing leadership qualities, developing necessary and attainable new skills, delegating skills that you cannot learn, and then adding accountability systems into the mix will make this be something that you're not just talking about, but you actually are moving to live. And finally, make sure that you utilize masterminds, mentors, coaches, supervisors, whoever, spouses, cousins, whoever, to be able to help you continue to move forward, because the road to successful leadership can be tough. And then, as always, follow ethical rules. Finally, I love getting to know people. If you've been here, I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me using any of the channels here. You'll see there's a QR code that will take you to my YouTube channel, which has all sorts of content, including interviews, as well as presentations from me and shorts and all sorts of stuff about leadership, how to be a successful leader, particularly if you're a lawyer. It's fascinating stuff. It's fun, and it can help anyone out who's taken the time and interest to be here today. And with that, I will turn this back over to Nina to close out, and I'm more than happy to stick around for a few minutes to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. We can now go ahead and move on to our Q&A. Looks like we already have a couple. I know we're a little bit short on time, so we'll take a few. Our first one is, how can I apply the processes discussed in the program to my current role and kind of minimize these risks, whether it's by telling myself some myths or something else?
So if I'm not answering this question, I do ask that you say I need a little bit more of clarification here, and then explain in which way I'm not being clear about this, because I want to make sure that any answer I give is meaningful to the person who's asked. So what I really recommend that you do is two things. First of all, set aside the time, especially since you've attended this, to download the supplemental materials on your free time, review it, begin to document the process that's here, as well as begin to answer the questions. I recommend, honestly, that you spend maybe what's called a miracle morning. If you can wake up a little early for, let's say, a couple of months, and just go through and meaningfully begin to answer these questions, begin to journal a little bit to think of what they might be, and then to begin to slowly but surely chip away at writing out these plans once you come to the answers. That's really how I would do it. I almost view implementing this stuff as the equivalent of taking a part-time class. Now, the good news is that this kind of part-time class is really interesting. It's really fun. It has a direct personal impact on you, and it can go at your own pace, but you do have to commit that time, and I really recommend setting aside time, even if it means getting up early or staying up a little bit late to do that. You've got to have quiet space and focus to be able to do this right. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah, we're not getting anything else in the queue, so I think so.
Good.
Thank you for that extra insight. Our next question is, how should the approach to leadership or growing into leadership roles differ when you're leading a large group or a small firm?
Yeah. Great question. First of all, the hardest part of stepping into leadership is going to be dealing with people. I would assume if I were advising anyone who's about to step into their first leadership role, that 50% of their time, if not more, will be spent dealing with interpersonal issues of your staff. And so the bigger your staff is, the more rife with potential interpersonal conflict there is, and the greater the degrees of personalities that you're going to have to deal with are out there. And so really what I would recommend, if you have a large staff or if it's a large organization that you step into, the organization may be large, but it may not be particularly complex in terms of its operations or its mission or its function in the world. If it is complex due to its size, then you need to also spend time learning it. But really, what's going to be most complex for you, as opposed to a smaller one, is navigating the personality types, spending a lot of time doing reading on or getting mentoring on emotional intelligence and social intelligence and how to navigate hierarchies. If someone wants to talk about readings or thinking about that, for heaven's sake, reach out to me on LinkedIn or through any of the channels above, and I'll be more than happy to point you to resources or give you thoughts. That's a great question, but people, that's going to be it.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. And then I think the last question that we have time for today is, how can I assess whether I'm ready to take on a leadership role? What steps should I take if I feel like I'm not ready yet?
So I love this question. The answer as to whether you're ready, I recommend, should always be yes. And you know why? Because think about what we talked about with regards to risk. The question itself, am I ready, is one that almost presupposes the danger associated with the risk. If you think you've got it in you, you've got it in you. And the fact that you cared enough to be here shows that you can do it. All that you need to do is understand that there's going to be mistakes along the way, and you're going to need to learn a lot and then dive in. Don't wait until you're ready. You know what? No one is ever ready. There are days I've been in leadership positions for more years than some people have been alive in this room I've had. And you know what? I'm still not ready, but you still dive in and you do it. Don't be afraid. You can do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott, for that additional insight and advice. And thank you all so much for submitting your audience questions. We want to thank you for joining us for another Justia webinar. Additionally, as today's presentation focused on how you can transition into leadership in your legal career, we wanted to remind you again of an easy way to get leads while you're focusing on your career advancement with the Justia Lawyer Directory. The Justia Lawyer Directory offers Justia premium placements. These placements allow for you to show up above organic listings and get above the organics and be able to be seen by the eyes that matter. So you can always select those for the practice area and location of your choosing. If you do want to find out more about increasing your visibility in the Justia Lawyer Directory, you can visit us at marketing.justia.com. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next video.